One of the interesting things that people tell me is that fleetingly and periodically, some other governor will surface. And this is that mainstream, taking care of business, let's improve the state governor that everyone hypothesizes is lingering inside Pawlenty. You know, if you judge him by his words and his demeanor, it seems like that's who he really is. If you judge him by his actions, he's about as far right, you know, in terms of budget, fiscal, and even social concerns as anyone you can imagine. My name is Michael Tortorello. I'm a writer at large for Minnesota Monthly Magazine. I have a story about Governor Tim Pawlenty called The Cipher that attempts, perhaps not successfully, to close in on the mysterious persona and political identity of the governor, who is, of course, now, you know, one of the two leading vice presidential candidates for John McCain. One of the things that the Speaker of the House, a Democrat, or DFL, or Margaret Kelleher Anderson, tells me is that she thinks of him as the Governor of Brigadoon, in that 1 minute this kind of rational actor appears and they start talking about a proposal, and then he goes back to the Batcave, if I could mix metaphors, and when he comes back, it's like that man is gone, and he's back to the same track and the same course of insufficient spending, cutting the budget, free market solutions. And there's a real question among journalists in particular, and also the political class, whether there's a better governor lingering in there who could have come out, you know, during a different political age. His very early mentors is a guy named Dennis O'Brien, who at the time is a up-and-coming education lawyer. And he is a kind of big Newt Gingrichian thinker, really powerful, bright, creative intellect. And he recruits Tim Pawlenty out of law school, I think as a first-year law student, which is unheard of. You always go for the second years, the third years, and brings him into practice. And I think those two spend a lot of time talking about the market, the free market, the idea that, and this is a quote he uses, that you'll never get anywhere as a Republican babysitting the budget on great society programs. That if you're just tweaking the margins of how much to spend on Medicare and Social Security, you're playing on the Democrats' ball field. That is not a way to win the ball game. So I don't think the new taxes pledge, the no new taxes pledge, is uncharacteristic for Pawlenty. I just think that actually making it, against the advice, I will say, of people like Steve Spigum, who was at that point the Speaker of the House and the most powerful Republican in the House, making that decision really circumscribes what he can do for the rest of his tenure as governor. I don't see it as a craven political act. I think it's consistent with his philosophy. It's just putting it out there makes it impossible to do anything else. This last term, there have been a couple of actions and decisions which seem more nakedly political than what is the norm for him. Something like I think a letter he attached to a Cuban farming proposal, a Cuban trade proposal, something he'd really never had a dog in that fight, and all of a sudden it became a pressing issue for him. That's clearly taken to curry advantage with, Miami Cubans of a certain generation even. But that has not been the rule for most of his career. The one decision that seems to have really set the course for everything that follows is his no new taxes pledge, which he signs at the behest of David Strom of the Taxpayers League. It's a Grover Norquist-y kind of moment in his career. He's running against Brian Sullivan, who's a very far-right, grassroots Republican-supported Republican entrepreneur. And I think he knows he needs to move right hard and fast, and he signs it, and everything else that follows in his governing career at the State House comes from that. It hamstrings him to an extent that you almost can't believe, particularly when you then have severe budget crises in the beginning, 2 or 3 years of his administration. He goes from being billions of dollars in surplus to being $4.5 billion in the red almost overnight, within 3 months. And trying to bridge that gap, eats up 4 years of his political career. Well, his big move that's most widely criticized is the cigarette tax user fee. The word fee being, printed in red type, underlined, and then, in 30-point times Roman versus everything else there because they don't want to call it a tax, right? That is his one step out of line with no new taxes. And I don't ultimately think that the Grover Norquist crowd particularly cares about that. Would they like to have seen Pawlenty dismantle every state program, cut education spending, cut healthcare spending? Yeah, that's their agenda, and they're quite explicit about that. They're not hiding anything. But has Pawlenty governed from a position farther to the right than any modern Minnesota governor? Indisputably, and they know that. So, by giving him a little bit of latitude on those points and pretending that there's some debate and discontent, it makes him seem rational and reasonable to Main Street Republicans and middle-of-the-road Democrats who wouldn't particularly want to vote for a strangle the baby in the tub republicanism, that famous Norquist phrase, that he talks about what he wants to do to government. Your average farmer or lawyer, in Mankato, although perhaps Republican, doesn't subscribe to that theory. And by giving the sense that he's on a continuum and not at the edge of that continuum, I think he gets greater latitude, this he being Governor Pawlenty, to really hold a hard Republican line.